So we have on our stage already participants of the next panels. I warmly welcome Professor Claudia Lenz, Mrs. Lea Micha, Mr. Ted Stanki, and Mr. Dmitro Haineddinov, and Natalia Tkachenko, the other main coordinator of the conference, who works, of course, at Auschwitz Memorial, will moderate the panel.
Yeah, so it is the pre-last panel of our conference. We have just discussed that we have already quite a lot to base upon or connect to. That is probably what we are going to do. The panel discussion is called Sharing Memory and Shared Memory, and that is what we wanted to do, to have a look at the practical side, the working with memory in practice with different groups, with polyphony of memories, from the institutional level as well, staying probably in the range of topics that have been right here mentioned in the previous panel. So among the panelists, we have Lea Micha, who is a political scientist and researcher, and since 2013 connected to Yad Vashem, currently the head of desk for Central, Eastern and Balkan Europe at the International School for Holocaust Studies there. And also previously collected experience as a scholar of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, among others, or as a research and publications editor at the Jewish Museum in Greece. Welcome, Lea. And Lea, also, we are very glad that you could travel from Israel. Finally, it was not an obvious thing in the last couple of weeks. Thank you. Then we have Professor Claudia Lenz, and Claudia is a professor in social science at the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society, and also holds a chair in prevention of anti-Semitism and racism. Also a research professor at the Center for Studies of Holocaust and Religious Minorities in Oslo, Norway. Among others, Claudia is the co-founder of DEMRA, Democratic Readiness Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, and currently leading the teacher educational branch. Thank you, Claudia, for joining us for this discussion. Dmitro Haineddinov is our colleague from Ukraine. Actually, the Deputy Director General of the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in the Second World War. Since 2014, actually connected to the institution. As a historian, he started there as a tour guide first, and later advanced into the position of the head of educational department, head of international cooperation department, and deputy director general for research. Thank you, Dmitro. It is also not that obvious that our colleagues from Ukraine can always come to us. So thank you very much for joining us here. And last but not least, we have Ted Stanki from the United States, representing the US HMM, so United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, as the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's William and Sheila Kona Director of International Educational Outreach, and also Director of the Museum's Initiative on Holocaust Denial and State-Sponsored Anti-Semitism. Thank you very much, Ted, also for joining us. And yeah, the discussion is supposed to present or maybe reflect upon the processes that take place in collective memory in the face of diversity, globalization. The idea of the panel is to talk about polyphony, as we may put it, polyphony understood in direction to memory, many memories, many voices, many experiences that come together in different narratives or in different places of multiple history, or also understood as in direction of target groups, as working with absolutely different and various optics with which people are coming to our places or are partaking from our educational offer. So yeah, we are going to also reflect upon how we as institutions can make it inclusive, how we can include the narratives, but also include different people into the something that we might call community of memory. So let us start with this polyphony as a number of simultaneous experiences and voices that come together at our places, places that are places of multiple history, places that are places that work with multiple narratives. Auschwitz, the memorial where I work at, is actually such a place. And first and foremost, of course, it stems from the variety of victim groups that over time have been persecuted and hence, as a result, at different points sent to Auschwitz. We have also, generally speaking of victim groups, we also have to use different mental shorthands, because if we speak about Jewish people, it's not a group of people that came from one place and had the same identity. Of course, here as well, we can see that sometimes even this polyphony is sometimes getting lost when we speak about the general number of Jewish victims in Auschwitz. So this is something we have to face, how to construct the narrative, how to construct our educational offer that someone coming here learns about the complexity of this memory, sees how many different memories come together. So what I wanted to ask at the beginning is, first of all, what is the experience of you and your institution in the field? What is the polyphony that you work with or tackle in your everyday work? So maybe we'll start with Tad, yeah, and then proceed.
Sure, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation. I feel like maybe I should say a word about my institution. It came up in the last panel question about it. So we are created by the US government, the Congress, and we call ourselves an independent establishment of the federal government. Well, what does that mean? It means that we do receive public funding for about half of our operating costs. We raise private funding for the other half. We have some employees of the federal government. We have some employees who are not. I'm not, for example. Much of our education work is privately funded. We do have a council of 50 members appointed by the White House typically for 5-year terms, although as was referred to, it's not necessarily the case always, and 10 members of Congress. So we are like this hybrid, complicated institution, and I would just like to say, in response to what was mentioned, that we have an important public responsibility as a public institution, accountability to U.S. taxpayers. And of course, there's always the danger of such institutions being weaponized and being politicized. So, and we live in a very fast-moving and volatile time. So I'd like to say one more thing about our institution, and I think it's related to our topic today, which is really, why do we have a Holocaust Museum in Washington? After all, this is what's the topic is mostly taking place in Europe. And a group of prominent Americans were asked what was the appropriate memorial for the victims of the Holocaust for the United States, and they came back in the 1970s with the idea of a living memorial, specifically a place where Americans could come and learn how and why the Holocaust happened, not just what happened, but what made it possible, because this happened in Germany and in Europe, where people were highly educated, advanced in terms of science, civilization, people obviously thought of themselves as very civilized, artistic achievement and so forth. So the fact that this happened is a warning to everyone. It could happen anywhere. The other two reasons, one is that there were questions about what was the American role. Could Americans have done things differently? And we have an exhibition on Americans in the Holocaust telling that story now in our museum. Also online, I encourage you to take a look at it. And finally, that our institution should give some voice and raise awareness about situations that could be constituting genocide. Because of the indifference, the international, let's say, indifference or lack of action during that period, and a perceived lack of awareness of what was going on. So this then comes finally to the point about this polyphonic memory, I'll just cite our definition of the Holocaust. So our definition of the Holocaust says that the Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Always followed by a second sentence, and that is that in this era, the Nazi regime also targeted particular groups, and we name them, on racial grounds, also on political grounds. And the reason that these two things are together goes back to what I was saying about the importance of what made the Holocaust possible, and that is including anti-Semitism, but also Nazi racial ideology, territorial ambitions, the fragility of human rights and protections for human rights. So we believe it's important to understand the Holocaust, which is a genocide against the Jews. In order to understand that, it's important to understand the context, and one of those elements about the context is what the Nazis were doing and other crimes that they were committing, and why those crimes could also be committed. And this is also reflected in our education and in our exhibition, where we have displays about different victim groups. And we're also constantly talking about Americans, which is the other, I guess, element that a polyphonic situation is always looking at what's going on and not divorcing the American perspective. So what Americans were doing, what they were knowing about, what they didn't know about, how they responded.
Do you connect to Americans at the same time? I mean, those Americans who lived in those times, or do you also connect to Americans who became Americans afterwards but are connected to the story, like Holocaust survivors who moved to America, or groups that came later after the story?
Well, yes, of course. So we're very blessed to have a very devoted and large, in the early days, not so much now, a group of Holocaust survivors who are actually involved throughout the operations of the institution, and in particular, in both our exhibition and our education, the displacement caused by the Holocaust, by the war, what was the fate of displaced persons, highlighting that there was no place really for them to go. So this was a real international crisis at the time. So that's also a part of it. Yeah.
Also not obvious to recipients of our education. Sometimes the thought of young people, why couldn't they just move to other country, has to be answered that there was no other country to move to, especially from some middle of the 30s. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dmytro. What is your context of polyphony in the museum in Kiev?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be present at such an honorable event. First of all, I would like to say a few words about my institution, because it has definitely a special story. So our museum, officially it is called National Museum of the History of Ukraine in the Second World War, was established 50 years ago in 1974. And it was one of the key objects of Soviet ideology, because the late Soviet ideological backbone was the mythology of the Great Patriotic War. It was the official definition for the war between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And also the museum reflected with all its architectural and memorial forms this mythology, because it was a huge and very pompous memorial space, and the main building of the museum is located under the tallest monument in Europe. This is a Motherland monument, the figure of a woman with a shield and a sword, with a height of 102 meters. And in 1970s, 80s, and also I believe 90s, the defining feature of the museum was that it represented this mythology of the Great Patriotic War, which did not disappear after 1991, after the collapse of Soviet Union. And in general, it was defined by glorification of the Soviet army and silencing most of other topics, including the topics of Nazi occupation, the survival of people under occupation, and it was, as I said in one of the previous days, for the first time, the definition Holocaust and the genocide of the Jewish people in museum appeared only in 1994. So it was 20 years after establishment of museum and 3 years after Ukraine became independent. And in such post-totalitarian societies, in general, the dominant model of remembrance is not so flexible and welcoming for new narratives and new experience to be highlighted and included. So I can say that the big changes, each of big changes, was the result of the big social and political crisis in Ukraine. So it was collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, also quite radical change in lives of people. Then I can say about 2014 when I started my work here, when the revolution happened in Kyiv and when the Russian aggression started. And I was quite fortunate to start my working experience on that year because, surprisingly, the Russian invasion resulted in failure of this mythology of Great Patriotic War in Ukraine, and it created quite a fruitful field for public discussion about Second World War. Just for comparing, when I started to work, for many people of the older museum generation, the Holocaust was rather their tragedy than our tragedy. And the most typical educational event, workshop, if I can say so, for students was like a remembrance lecture dedicated to some Soviet general who took part in expulsion of Nazis from Ukraine. And in few years, many things have changed, and first of all, the topic of the Holocaust was not further represented as their tragedy. It was a very important fact, and many artifacts, many stories were collected and researched by the museum. But also what is important, that in these few years after 2014, such a variety of new topics appeared in the museum expositions that maybe it was never before this. Maybe only in 1990s such deep changes happened. First, for example, before 2014, nobody cared about highlighting the deportation of the Crimean Tatars and other ethnic groups from Ukraine by Soviet government. And after the Crimean Tatars became persecuted by Russia again in Crimea, so this topic became actual relevant and this topic became highlighted. Even deeper changes happened after 2022 because much of Russian propaganda justifying the invasion was based on the rhetorics of the Great Patriotic War. That's why in these few years Ukraine went further from this mythology, and in general, for our museum, it was a new stage of our history because we started to work with the topic of the current war. And the first experience of us was in 2014 and in the following years when we started to show the current events. But the serious and very intense stage happened after 2022 when we organized field expeditions, when we tried to include, to document the stories of both civilians and military in the ongoing war. And now it's the time in our museum when we have a big change, big transformation. So we have a big part of our projects dedicated to the current war, which is a very special experience to highlight and research the events which are underway. But also we are preparing now the big new exposition dedicated to Ukraine in World War II. And we are going to present it this year as its 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So generally saying, it's very difficult. It was very difficult to move beyond this ideological system which was constructed in Soviet times. Many remnants of this system can be felt now in the collective memory of Ukrainian people, of course. It's because such events and processes cannot pass without any traces. But for our museum, it's important now to be a center where the diverse vision of World War II is formed, but also where the remembrance of the current war is formed. This is a big challenge for us. It's like a big sandbox. We work in the field where no rules are written. Okay, I can say that there are some methodic recommendations issued by local authorities for institutions working with documenting the current war, but they appeared only recently, and they appeared in many senses based on our previous experience. That is why this is a challenge for us. And we have also a few challenges in our work. So the first challenge, as we say now, is to include diverse stories in museum narratives, both diverse stories from period of World War II. And we need to continue this polyphony. We need to continue constructing this mosaic of history, which not always consists of alike pieces. But also we need to preserve the memory of the current war. And our wish as for the museum is also to integrate our vision into a global cultural and informational sphere. That is why our museum tries to be very active internationally. We have our exhibitions in 15 countries abroad, and we are very open to cooperation. But also we want to include international context into our projects now. That is why we try to show both, for example, realities of Second World War in other fronts or other parts of the world, for example, the Lend-Lease or the fighting of Western allies in World War II, or the events of the Holocaust in not in the Soviet territories, but in the Central and the Western Europe. But also from the position of the current war, we try to preserve, for example, the stories of international support of Ukraine. We have now a big exhibition about international volunteer fighters who have their own subculture in Ukraine, of course, quite separate from the culture of Ukrainian native military. And this is also the demonstration that we would like to make our museum not only national but also international place of remembrance of such historic events as current war as well. Thank you. Sorry for long speech.
Thank you very much. I think for many of us it is a perspective that we don't know, and it's very interesting to hear it also from your side, the person who actually works with construction of exhibitions, hence narratives in such a museum under such circumstances. Thank you. Claudia, please, could you speak on your experience from the Norwegian point of view, but maybe also a bit wider, so please.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's quite interesting to have this session this late in the conference, because through the lens of our institutions, and I think we saw it already with the previous speakers, I think we are going to process rather many of the topics we have been discussing during the last days. And when I prepared this, it struck me. Because when talking about the Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies in Oslo, it was established as a result of the restitution of the robbed property of the deported and killed Jews in 1942 and 1943. And it was, so it is entangled with this history of the 2000s and the restitution and this international climate around it, or the late 90s, early 2000s. And by then it felt naturally also as a wish of the Jewish community that we should have this double mandate to both do research, be a museum, and do education related to the Holocaust, and especially the Norwegian history about it, but also to have this broader mandate related to minorities, religious minorities, and the present. So this past-present was already, and this universalist outlook, which was discussed yesterday, is in a way embedded. And by then, it was regarded to be harmonic, and we will come back to that. But when it comes to polyphony, it of course starts with this very establishment as a result of the restitution, telling the story of the Norwegian Holocaust, because it was an intervention into the broader national narrative, the master narrative about being an occupied country, having been, in a way, morally on the right side. These historical myths that almost everybody was in the resistant regard, only those few Quislings were not, and so on. So it was it added to this polyphony of existing stories in the public realm to tell the stories of the victims, which is a very important part of our exhibition and educational work. But none the least, we were the first to address the issue of perpetrators. Because in this context of education, of course, it was the idea it has to be the Germans. But there is rather a depressing story of Norwegian co-perpetratorship, and which still in our research is emerging chapter. Now it's about, for example, this economical plundering, where also everyday Norwegians were part of it, bureaucrats were part of it, and so on, the Nazified police and so on. So this is part of this adding to the polyphony of historical consciousness, public awareness, and so on, and lots of research and educational activities were related to that. Then at some point, a new layer came, and this is the Holocaust of the Rome, Norwegian Rome population, because they were not deported from Norway during the occupation. They already had been expelled and made stateless in the 1930s. So they ended up being deported, many of them from Belgium. And now also this is part of the story, which is integrated in our memorial and educational and research. So you can see it's in a way a growing dimension of multi-layeredness, and if you want, so polyphony. But until that point, it can be told as a quite harmonious. We add on necessary layers as we get more enlightened about the blind spots of national history. But in a way, it starts to become more complicated when we add on the layer of intergenerational memory and our audiences and the public, the diversity, which we have been discussing. And this really becomes quite challenging now in the context which has been discussing in the previous session after October 7th, it seems that also these two parts of our mandate, like the Holocaust-related and the minority, and especially which has been related to a large degree to anti-racist work and so on, Islamophobia and so on, that this is creating or regarding attention, regarded to be in tension, and also the question is in a way not only which narratives can be told, but also who owns the interpretation of these narratives. And this is, I think, something we're going to be discussing, because sharing is not only providing information and making it accessible. Of course, it's always about the question which frames of references, which interpretations are valid and accepted. And here we now see that the question of who owns this history, what should be the present day lectures telling Gaza. 7th of October, of course, there it started. It was a major, this trauma had Holocaust-related references, of course, but then also this question of genocide. We have visitors, young visitors, angry visitors who say, how can't you talk about that, or what's about that? And I think this is very interesting to historicize the mandate and the emergence of our center, to see that what 20 years ago was regarded to be harmonious and well working together, now suddenly really is exposed for major tensions and is contested, really.
Thank you very much. And Leah, could you also add on from the perspective of Israel and Yad Vashem working there?
Thank you very much. So I'll start by thanking you very much for having me here. It wasn't obvious, tickets were cancelled. We agree, all of us in this room, that there is no harmony at this point in our world, and yet we have to move on and not just keep doing our work, but finding ways to make it in an efficient manner. So many thanks for getting this ticket last minute. We grabbed the opportunity, and I'm very thankful. I'm going to be less than 20 hours in Poland, and I'm looking forward to coming back already. It's an amazing conference, and the panel of this morning was a very strong one, giving us food for thought. Now, I'm obviously representing Yad Vashem, which is the old Holocaust Remembrance Center, and it's also Israel's National Remembrance Authority. I'm starting with a statement. Well, first of all, it was established in 1953, 5 years after the creation of the State of Israel. And our mandate, going back to the mandates, is talking about the Jewish story and remembering, commemorating the close to 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So relating to what you mentioned about Auschwitz, in Yad Vashem, polyphony does not exist. We do not have, in a sense, all victim groups in one space. However, polyphony does exist in at least a couple of different manners. One of them is that we act in a global context and we teach in a global context. When I say we teach, Yad Vashem is based since its mandate in 1953 with the law of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and until today, of course, on 4 pillars: remembrance, documentation, research, and education. The last one is the pillar which is the most growing today. And within Yad Vashem, the place where I work, and my dear colleague Yiftach Meiri, who is also here, is the International Institute for Holocaust Education, and we do work within a global context with cooperation with more than 70 countries, with educational materials created and translated in many, many, many languages, and with different target audiences, mainly educators, coming to us and us going to them. So in this sense, polyphony does exist in the target audiences, and from our point of view, also the need exists to adapt, to create a way in order to connect, and connect in as much as possible in an unconditional manner. We heard in the previous panel, interestingly, about UK commemorating after October 7, different institutions or saying that we were ready to commemorate, mark the International Holocaust Remembrance Day under the condition of, if you mention, if there's a mention in what is happening in Gaza. And I also heard on the other side that we are ready to, we are ready to work and cooperate, but I want people to name the anti-Semitism of Hamas. So these two conditionalities can actually be quite problematic. And from our point of view, we are making a very serious effort, and it's not taken for granted in these very tense days that we face in Israel and in Jerusalem, in the Mount of Remembrance, where we are located, to deal, to come across, to meet, to talk without conditionalities. So in the educational, in the seminars, we are organizing professional development seminars. This is one model among many others. We are meeting, we are listening to each other's stories. We relate, we're making serious effort to relate to other stories. And I said that at the end of the day, we are Israel's National Remembrance Authority. So we see ourselves as part of this fabric of memory where where the Jewish story is the story that we are presenting. How do we deal now, practical aspects with this polyphony? One of the methods that we use is the use of biographies, of authentic documents, authentic personal documents. Also in research, as I mentioned, Yad Vashem's Institute, International Institute for Holocaust Research, also uses ego documents together with historical documents, of course. And in these biographies, we see this polyphony, and we use biographies where polyphony is more represented than in others when we need and we want, aspire to create these connections. In that, we see the values of the multidirectional memory, a term coined by Michael Rothberg, which enables us to get out of our more or less restricted borders of the Jewish case, and find, broaden the historical context and open up to other victim groups and victims of other historical events of this kind. I'll give you an example, a very short example of Dr. Albert Memmi. He's a very unique case of a Jew born in Tunis in the in the Jewish quarter of Tunis in 1920. He was a brilliant student, started studying in Algeria philosophy. Later on, when there was Nazi occupation, obviously stalled his ambitions. The Vichy regime in Algeria and the anti-Jewish legislation excluding Jews from all rights and citizenship made that Memmi was expelled from the university, returns to Tunisia. In his work, in his first book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, includes all these complex situation of being a Jew in an Arab country, of Western countries like France and Germany trying to or hoping to steer the Muslim population against the Jews, which in his words did not work back then. Later on, when Tunisia is liberated in May 1943, he finds himself in Paris. He continues to study. He becomes a professor of university. And Dr. Albert Memmi, he could have very easily stayed in his very convenient Parisian academic world. Yet, he becomes close to Arab nationalists in Paris and fights against the colonization. So this is one among the stories that we use in order to tackle and bring in polyphony and tackle the distance. And we also, after the Abraham Accords, for example, between Israel and a few Arab countries, we were working also with representatives from Arab countries. So in every case, finding the right voice to create connections.
Thank you very much. And from your comments, we already can see that for us, this polyphony of the place itself is not something that we really have an urgent need to tackle now. It's rather the polyphony of target groups and the optics that people come with to our places. It stems from different processes. Some of them were neutral, like migration or global outreach that we're trying to do to make our memory more present in the globalized world. Intergenerational transfer of memory, which has to happen because every year we get a new generation. I mean, okay, every 20 years, roughly, in scientific discourse, that's how we define a generation. So at least the fourth generation now is coming to our places. Quite often, for example, as a guide, as an educator, I face groups that even do not understand what the assess means. And you speak about the assessment and you see that for them it's just, okay, the assessment, what is it? And then you have to explain it. And I think that was not the case like 40 years ago or 60 years ago when my colleagues who were Auschwitz survivors, for example, started to constitute this place as a memorial, and they had to guide the first groups. They didn't have to explain who the assessment were or who were the perpetrators in this place. And this is sometimes the case with the new generation, to explain who exactly constructed Auschwitz and why, what was the story before that. So, for example, such thing. But also, I think one process that we can mention would be the polarized society, as this contested memory that stems from the mere fact that we have people who do not agree on many things, and they do not agree in such a very, I wouldn't say always radical, but a very active way, let's say. They do not agree in such a way that they have the need to manifest it, to show it, and to prove it to the other group that they are wrong. And then they come to us and encounter the memory, and we are working with them. So the question is, how we make it relevant for them, how we ensure that they connect to it. Also, I mean, these different groups, or what is your experience with working with this diversity, with these optics? Maybe you could pick some things that are closer to your experience also, and dwell upon them. Ted, would you like to pick up on
Sure,
this
thank
thing?
you. And this is a really important topic for me, because my role at the museum is to lead a team to do outreach, to reach people who are not coming already to our museum, who are not coming to our website, to reach people in places where we know that Holocaust denial and distortion and glorification and related anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories are influential, are prevalent. So this was an intentional thing on our part. And maybe before talking about how we're addressing such groups, is just to connect with the last panel, right? Because I think that the topic of reaching broad, diverse, global public, to me, is very much bound up in, and you just said it, this sense of crisis. And I think that we find that there's a tremendous amount of, and growing, questions, hostility, obstacles, a sense of irrelevance of this topic. So when you're thinking about, and we work all over the world, in Europe, in the Arab countries, with Iranians, in Latin America, and Asia, and Africa. So in many parts of the world, this is a European history, right? It's kind of a long time ago. We don't need to learn about the Holocaust to understand, how horribly Europeans can treat people, right? We have that in our own history, let's say. The Holocaust has something to do with Jews, right? So that also makes people feel uncomfortable. Oh, the Jews, and then all this questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and people, they don't want to talk about Holocaust because it's somehow taking sides in their mind in the current conflict in Gaza. And that, we should be talking about other histories. We talk too much about the Holocaust. So anyway, I think we're all familiar with those things, but to reach people today across a diverse set of backgrounds and opinions, we need to take these attitudes and obstacles into account. So a lot of our work is, how do you open the door to being to learning about the history? So even before you get to what you teach, you need to open the door. And so the way that we try to do that is go where people are. So we're developing partnerships, because we find that partners are critical because they can help define what's relevant. What's relevant about the Holocaust for Iranians or for Nigerians or people from India or Argentina, or even more and more people in the United States. It requires knowing something about that audience and knowing what people are thinking, and it requires partners who can help you determine what is the rationale for even learning about the Holocaust. And we can talk for a long time about that, but I'll say just a couple of things. One is about history, and that there's hardly any place you can go in the world that doesn't somehow historically touch the events of the Holocaust and the Second World War. It's always, there's very interesting stories in all different places, and more scholarship coming out about that. There is often a recognition that the Holocaust and the war are seminal events in world history, and you can't understand the current world in which we're living without understanding those events and how they shaped the international systems of human rights and relations, et cetera. And also there's great interest, and it's come up before, about the processes. So how could this happen? What made it possible? Related to social solidarity, related to the protection of rights, dehumanization, anti-Semitism, racism, all of these different contexts. So there's different rationales, and maybe here I can touch on this question of universalism. But there are different rationales, but once the doors open, it's very important for us not to forget what is the basic things that we're trying to communicate, right? So the Holocaust happened. It happened. It was about Jews. And there can be a tendency of have a Holocaust without Jews and without anti-Semitism. Of course, there's no Holocaust without Jews. There's no Holocaust without anti-Semitism. And that it was bad. I mean, it was really bad. There's a tendency to minimize, to glorify, and it's important to ensure that people understand that this is not a conspiracy theory, learning about this. it's worse than you think, always. And then the last thing, and then I'll stop, is that there has to be something of value to the learner from different places, from different orientations, from different points of view about the history. If you want to help people think critically about what they think they know about the Holocaust, is to deliver something that they feel is valuable that they learned. And again, we're not dictating that, but beyond what I just said, we're working with our partners to ensure that people see that value, and that can help, again, overcome some of these obstacles. Thank you.
Thank you. I think here we are echoing a bit the idea that was mentioned by Matthias about this, what people connect to, where this relevance for them lies in the history that we work with. And thank you very much. I think we as people working in different institutions can refer to many things that you mentioned. But something that will stay with me, this idea that working with the topic of the Holocaust is taking sides. I mean, I also have felt it. I mean, my intuition, educational intuition, shows me that sometimes it really happens. I mean, not only coming to Auschwitz, even commemorating, yes, as Olivia also mentioned in the previous panel discussion. I mean, really, it has come to that point where engaging in some topic or working with some topic means taking sides, although it should not. I mean, these are different people that we are talking about, the ones that we are commemorating and the ones that are connected to the current situation. Yeah. So thank you very much for articulating
if I could
that.
just say one thing, just to be clear, that, and I mentioned this in my intervention last time, is that we need to take seriously that thought, right? Even though it seems learning about the Holocaust is not about taking sides, we need to take that seriously, and we need to work with learners about where that's coming from to move beyond it.
Exactly. Thank you. Dmytro, what about your context and the polyphony of target groups, optics of people who come to you?
It's a very interesting question about challenges which we face when we speak about such a complex topics as the Holocaust is, of course. So I would like to concentrate on this topic particularly because this is very important, and I believe that there are many stereotypes around in the global information space about the acceptance and understanding of the Holocaust realities in Ukraine and by Ukrainian society. And first of all, of course, we need to understand that for many years, in general, and the problem still exists, that not the whole society is ready or is willing to accept the complexity of these processes. And for a long time, in the post-Soviet times, in the early decades of independence, there was quite a comfortable narrative that the Germans came, the Germans made mass murders, and the local population was either bystanders or saviors. In our museum, it was quite late when we tried to show different aspects of this genocide, particularly the relations, the inter-ethnic relations in Ukraine during this time, and also the models of behavior of the Slavic population in the conditions of the genocide. So in 2019, it was the first time in our museum when we displayed the materials of the Ukrainian auxiliary police. And in 2021, I think it was one of our most successful experiences and one of the most all-round expositions. We created the big exposition, The Holocaust. It was timed to 80th anniversary of the Babin Yar tragedy, and it was the first time probably when we tried to demonstrate first the personal stories of people who were murdered in Babyn Yar. It was very difficult to demonstrate, to highlight, because in this case we have very big difficulties with identifying the victims, with showing their particular artifacts, their stories, not only collective tragedy, but also it was a need to personify this dimension of the tragedy, this part of history. And we had the special thematic section which demonstrated different models of behavior of the Ukrainian population, ethnic Ukrainians. You know, this classic division between bystanders, perpetrators, and the saviors. For us, it's important to show the courage, the civil courage of Ukrainian people who helped the Jewish people to survive. We understand that they were in much smaller minority, of course. But it's also important for us to show their courage and their contribution. But it was also important for us in the time to show also that there were some powers in society, among Ukrainian people, who helped the invaders to commit the genocide. And this was really very resounding exhibition in the cultural space, in the information space of Ukraine. Unfortunately, we had to dismantle it on 24th of February 2022, as many materials were loaned from partners institutions, and the exhibition was evacuated to west part of Ukraine. But it was very important case for us. And I can say also that still, the biggest problem in Ukraine, for example, is not denial of the Holocaust, because in general, this problem is not typical for Ukraine. The problem is the tendency to simplify. And it's the problem rooted in the lack of knowledge, especially by younger generations. That's why since pre-war times, if I can say so, we try to carry out different types of educational activities for different age groups of students. And particularly together with me at the seminar is Alla Hrushecka, who is an educator in museum, and she developed a few such workshops for teenagers in order to show that the Holocaust is not just a simple process which can be described in two sentences, but it's much more complex phenomenon in history. And my final words, of course, are that the problem still exists, of course. So we still have a lot of space to work with. Not about the Holocaust, but very demonstrative case. In our museum, we have such practice as methodical trainings for teachers of history. And when Alla was working with the teachers from one of the eastern Ukrainian cities, the teacher in the part of the exposition dedicated to deportation of the Crimean Tatars, and very important, in the presence of his students, she said, well, eventually that was a very reasonable deportation, because the Crimean Tatars did betray Soviet government and collaborate with Nazis. It was a teacher of history, it was the eve of the full-scale invasion, and it was the group of students who studied history of World War II. And this was very disturbing. This case was discussed by our team, and for sure it shows that still we have a lot of work to do.
Maybe this teacher didn't connect to the idea that he connected to some other idea. I wanted to maybe precise, what were the reactions of people coming to this exhibition that you mentioned? Because also USHMM has experience with exhibitions talking about neighbors, and a lot of us working with the Holocaust have this experience of talking about, we were also sometimes not fully, saving everyone, and especially Jewish people during the persecution. Did they connect to that story, or did they come to say, no, we do not agree, you are talking about something that was not like that?
It's interesting, but in my memory, and in that time I worked in education department, which provided excursion programs and organized them. So we didn't face some kind of negative reactions. It was important to speak to people. It was important that also probably it was a needed measure that we implemented this topic very, quite gradually. So first in 2019 we started to implement this topic in the exposition. Then in 2021 it was already much deeper and highlight of this deeper presentation of this topic. So it was normal reaction from society. It was constructive dialogue, and we didn't face some kind of radical groups that came to museum and protested that you are blackening Ukrainian history. Now, of course, in Ukraine, maybe we can find, and it's not so problem to find them, such people that will say, so you are playing for Russia because you say that Ukrainians also took part in these crimes. It's very necessary to speak honestly and to speak objectively. So it's not my task now to touch the Russian ideology and the Russian propaganda, but it's very important for Ukraine to speak on these topics, because much part of Russian propaganda now is concentrated around one simple thesis, that all Ukrainians are Nazis or their sympathizers, that all Ukrainians, or almost all Ukrainians, in World War II collaborated with the Nazis. And because of this, Russia has moral right to invade Ukraine and to carry out, how they say, denazification of Ukraine. And it's a very dangerous simplification, and we need to react somehow also. And we need to find not easy answers to difficult questions.
Thank you very much. Claudia, you have started already touching upon these issues, so could you dwell on them?
Yeah, the controversy and how to meet different groups who come with a certain expectation. Also, in a way, what kind of agenda we have. And I think this is a comment on the last session too, which I think is very important for me in this context, that we were talking about weaponization, and that, for example, genocide is weaponized, and we were talking about Holocaust distortion and so on. I think what is very important to be honest about is that weaponization also happens the other way around, and that my fields of work, research of anti-Semitism and Holocaust memory, are being weaponized, also in order to reduce freedom of speech and in order to stigmatize all kind of pro-Palestinian engagement. And just one example is, once in a while, very seldom, but once in a while, some students would appear in our students group with a keffy. And you could say, what kind of provocation is this? Is this in a way a reject of like everything we have to offer here? But you could also, in a way, and this is about sharing. Like, if we are really sharing what we have to offer, we need to establish a kind of reciprocity and a kind of not being stuck in this, in ourselves, in this assumptions of the polarized discourse, thinking we know what that means, and rather, in a way, invite to say, okay, here you come, what I see is you are engaged in that. Other, I can't know. And then, in a way, put to the table, what do we have to offer? And what we know is that because we also work with personalized stories, we have a lot to offer, which engages young people. And then to say, okay, what are the references? What are the interpretations which we could apply here? And a very recent example which caused a scandal in the Norwegian public was a wall image with Anne Frank with a keffy. It has been appearing different places already. Then now it appeared in a Norwegian city, and it was very, very quickly a polarized discourse where some would say this is Holocaust distortion, this is anti-Semitism. But then this artist said, yeah, but for me it's the universalized message about suffering, innocence. It was innocent children in war. And of course you could say you completely missed it. But I think as an educational space, it would be to me our best strategy to put these two interpretations on the table and say, okay, look, let's explore this. Let's explore why this is so provocative and why that this might be problematic, but let's acknowledge the sincere wish, and also that when youngsters interpret Holocaust symbols and icons in this way, they are also a product of a memory culture, which also our institution has created. So, for example, blaming them or telling them that you can do this and this is anti-Semitism, for example, I think would be the worst thing we could do. So I think the very difficult and important task for us is to take the starting point in the narratives, in the stories we have to tell, but creating the space beyond this polarization and opening the possibility to really negotiate what does this mean for us today, and are we still sincere with the historical? It's not about relativizing or saying, no, then we compromise with the historical facts. But I think our problem is really that there are assumptions about what kind of agenda we have, and we really need to resist that and to create this real shared spaces.
Resist, but on the other hand also include it, as you mentioned, yes, make a dialogue with something that already functions and somehow gets introduced into.
And I think an important thing is this reflexivity, which also has been mentioned in previous sessions, that I think we need to signal that we have not 100% facet, a moral, how should you come out here with a kind of moral lesson, but that there is a space that they can enter with their baggage also of history, of experiences, of grievances, and not experience being manipulated in something which is ready-made and non-negotiable.
Also this anger that was mentioned in the previous panel, sometimes I feel there is much of it that has to be addressed as well. We cannot just overlook it, hoping it will just dwindle down. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Claudia. Many of the things that you mentioned I had in mind. But this is what teaching Holocaust in a global context is, like trying to avoid all these pitfalls of binary relations, and it's like memories, as to rephrase what you said, should not silence one another. I mean, Professor Yehuda Bauer, may he rest in peace, he was Yad Vashem's chief historian. Now these days that actually Israel and Yad Vashem experts are the chairman of VIRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as his words echo more and more. He tirelessly pointed out that violence, there is no, how can I say, the suffering of the victims is the same, and torture is the same, and child torture and child murder and rape is rape, and this is something that we. It's something to take into account, the point of view of the other. I already mentioned before examples of how we try to address through biographies. Just, I know our time is limited, just a few examples of target groups that we are at Yad Vashem dealing with, and we are trying to create special programs that adapt to their needs. We deal with young-aged learners, and we have since decades now an age-appropriate a method, the spiral approach, quite sophisticated. We are creating easy language materials for special education programs, trying to reach also this vulnerable sector of education and of our society. We are developing new programs and projects for the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox part of the Israeli society. Huge challenges. I mean, we are thinking about the global context, but when within national context, the tensions can be quite strong, and one has to find ways to go closer to the other while keeping one's own integrity and mandate. Dealing with the Arab educational sector within the Israeli society, I mentioned earlier our work with representatives from Arab countries with which Israel has peace accords. This, as one can imagine, actually might be easier than dealing with the Arab sector within Israel. And there is a new strategy at the moment developed within Yad Vashem that focuses, and it's relevant to the place that we are now, the focus on authenticity. So instead of bringing, for example, Arab educators to Yad Vashem, we are organizing through the Israeli Ministry of Education such programs with the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. So thus the authenticity that we opted for a more formal strategic plan where the accent is on the authentic sides. And what else? Dealing with heterogeneous learning groups, I already mentioned, and let us move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, maybe let us open the floor for a couple of questions that probably are there. Maybe I will follow also Marine, thinking of people who haven't spoken yet. So let us start with here.
Thank you very much for the panel. My name's Isaac. I'm at WashU, Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. I teach and write and lecture on a lot on the Inquisition, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism. So maybe my question's more for Tad and Leah, but I'll tell you very briefly, one of the gravest or greatest challenges that I've faced, certainly in the U.S. Holocaust world, trying to visit and speak, is the traditional neglect or oversight of the Sephardic and Mizrahi narratives. There's been, it seems to me at least, some degree of resistance to even speaking about it. I don't want to name particular names, but on several occasions when I brought up about, for example, going through the exhibits, there's not even a mention of Salonika and the destruction of that entire community, the near annihilation of Ladino-speaking Jews who were shipped here, let alone Rhodes and Kos and Corfu that came at the same time as the Hungarian Jews, or nearly around the same time. And one director of education, when I proposed a program, she said, "Why would we talk about that?" She said, "There's no interest in those stories." So I think it's a suppression of narratives or a disregard of narratives even within a certain community. And that's just, again, one of the greatest challenges that I face. The one other thing I just mentioned is, and I understand the Holocaust museums and all institutions have to deal with competing memories and pressures and things like that, but I found also in some places there perhaps should be at least a mention of the long history of anti-Semitism, because I feel that you go into some of these museums, there's nothing, and it starts off as idyllic, and there was kumbaya, and everything was fine, and the Holocaust came out of nowhere. And I've led tours myself, or at least unofficial tours, and people say, "I didn't know any of this. I didn't know there was a long history or the 2,000 years." And so those are kind of my thoughts. I'd be curious for your reactions, and I hope that things can change, but I do think that maybe this can help to combat some of the challenges that we have been talking about at this conference. Thank you.
Well, I'll go first. Thank you for the comments. We are in our museum in the process of working on a new permanent exhibition, and certainly what you mentioned about Sephardi, Mizrahi this is, it's recognized as a gap. We need to open up more of the geography, also of the diversity of Jewish life, and say more about that. Regarding the second point, which I also think is really important, and it's indeed not as present in our current exhibition as many of our educators and myself would like it, is the long history of anti-Semitism. And it's part of, again, for us, this idea of what made the Holocaust possible, and very much is a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe and the virulence of it and how it changes in many ways, and how does anti-Semitism fuel the Holocaust, and what role it plays. So in our educational work, our work with American teachers and our lesson plans, this is something which we're emphasizing more. If I could just say one other thing, I said we work in the Arab countries, and my colleague and I, for several years have gone to Egypt to encourage more discussion there about the Holocaust, and we met with people there who, told us, well, the Holocaust has nothing to do with Egypt. This is Ashkenazi story, So over time, that's changed, and there's a recognition that it's a much bigger story. It can't be dismissed, even among Jewish communities, as this is an Ashkenazi story. It doesn't have to do with us.
If I may, just a short comment. You touched a very sensitive vein of mine. Since before dealing with education, I was a researcher working on the deportations of Greek Jews. And so when I hear Salonika and Corfu and Rhodes and Kos, I cannot but react and say that from Yad Vashem's point of view, it is part of the story told in the museum. It wasn't in the past, as Dr. Noam Kaiton, the director of the Overseas Department, usually says. When she was brought up in Germany, they used to think that the Holocaust was something between Germans and Jews, and maybe also Poles. So till then, it's a very dynamic thing. And like Tad said, things are being added and updated. And nowadays, for example, we have groups at Yad Vashem coming from Morocco, complaining about how the Moroccan story is not included enough within our museum, and King Mohammed V of Morocco is not recognized as righteous among the nations. So to give a different perspective. Thank you for your question.
So maybe some more questions. Mishko? On the other side, the mic is coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the fascinating panel, very interesting. I would like to ask a question to all of you, and adding a point to the title of the panel, Sharing Memory and Shared Memories. I would like to add, how do we share experiences to prepare to what's coming? Namely, we are talking about the crisis today, but post-Second World War, Europe has faced a bloody war before on the European soil. It happened in my former country, Yugoslavia, in the 90s. And unfortunately 30 years later, we are in a post-conflict society that has a huge problem with dealing with the past, not only with the past in the 90s, but the past of the Second World War and the Holocaust. We are facing tremendous politicization, distortion, instrumentalization for the purposes of nationalist propaganda, inflating fear, hate, and new violence. So I'm inviting and pledging everybody, let us learn from what already happened. We already have post-conflict society after Second World War in the middle of Europe, and it did not go well, neither for the dealing with that conflict or not with the how do we deal with the Holocaust, which is the main point here. So I would like to ask you, how are you preparing for what is coming? And how can we work together and help each other to study and share the experiences that we are having on the Balkans as a post-conflict society to prepare for what's coming in Ukraine and in Israel and in other places where we are all hoping to preserve this memory and also turn it into something constructive for the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. That's a very good question, and as we also have this educational programs, we're talking a lot about democratic resilience nowadays, and this is not only in the face of there might be war, but also the anti-democratic tendencies, the authoritarian tendencies, and so on. And I would like to mention two aspects which, to my view, are very important. One is understanding dehumanization, being aware of the mechanisms of dehumanization, exploring dehumanization, that it's not always only portraying somebody as a rat, but how dehumanization also is normalized. And there, the historical references, the historical material always is a very good starting point in order to make the links to the present. And again, build on the experiences of our audiences, like what is going through the social media channels of the children and youngsters we're working with gives lots of material. So I think this dehumanization, rehumanization axis is very important. And then the second one, now I have lost my thought. I need to come back to that.
Thank you for your question. It's a very important question. I think that what the you can continue. I will finish myself.
Okay.
Later.
Just the second one. I think it is very important, and it was mentioned again in the last session that we should not work with this moral imperatives, which I think is a kind of the original sin of Holocaust education, this never again. Like this idea that there is kind of catharsis when you come out of our education, you will be vaccinated. Instead, one thing we apply is moral dilemmas. We have one activity which is about responsibility, different positions in people could have in the Norwegian society during the Holocaust, and everything from really ideological functionaries to a taxi driver who was hired to bring and those people who profited and so on, and to engage youngsters with the moral choices and the dilemmas in given contexts. I think this is also part of building resilience for situations which might come where people need to make difficult moral choices. Thank you for letting me coming back.
Thank you once again for your question. I think that one of the main responsibilities of institutions working with history and historical remembrance is to teach, especially young generations, to have a responsible attitude towards the past and present, because all anti-democratic regimes, all dramatic and tragic changes in human history began with the idea that the difficult questions can be answered very, very simply, in a simple way. Unfortunately, now if you trace some such like popular social medias like the X platform, we will find many samples of very dangerous simplification of history, very dangerous weaponization and instrumentalization of history. This is the main thing. And also, it's a different answer maybe, but as I said, our museum has the international vector as one of its priorities in this time. And we want our expositions to serve a warning. What can happen if the democratic world is not consolidated, is not decisive enough to prevent autocracies from repeating the expansionist practices of the past. Our museum is one of the few institutions, I believe, quite few in the world, that can show through its collections and documents the 3 periods of occupation. Soviet occupation of Ukraine, Nazi occupation of Ukraine, and modern Russian occupation of part of Ukrainian territory. And all these 3 events, 3 phenomena in our history are marked with brutal violations of human rights, by mass murders, by deportations of people, so of civilians, by destruction of the social infrastructure. And this is important that the institutions like museums and memorials and non-government organizations, even if they don't speak about the contemporary events, but they serve as a warning about not repeating the tragic mistakes of the past.
Would you like to also, I think it's serves as a good closing point. So Claudia and Dmytro have already expressed your ideas. So maybe Ted and Leah, you would like to say some final words?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. I guess I would say that, and I haven't really mentioned it, but the one part of what we do, especially with partners in Germany and in Poland, is with an exhibition about the role of ordinary people and the choices made by ordinary people. And I think what we've found is that this is a way to engage young people in particular on a topic that is interesting, to them, because and interesting to educators, because the question always is, well, what is my role and responsibility today? And it's a way to talk about again, another aspect of what made the Holocaust possible, which is the role of ordinary people, that it didn't come from, just a small group of leaders, and it can prompt this, this discussion, particularly when led by young people themselves. I don't know if it totally answers the challenges of post-conflict society, but it's one way to go deeper into this idea of what we can learn from the past, and not jump to these categorical statements that was mentioned. So that's what I would say.
Would you like to say?
What is there left to say after these wise words? Maybe 2 things. One, that sometimes when in public discourse, let's put all the conflicts and wars and everything aside, public discourse by itself has this tendency of flattening up the topics, and this sometimes also leads to misinterpretation. I'm not bringing anything new on the table right now, but there is this tendency when it comes to commemoration, Holocaust commemoration, to leave understanding aside, and this is very problematic. So it's a message to keep in mind, not only memory but also education. We need solid content. We need voices, authentic voices. People tend to get tired. I mean, I bet we are all faced with a known Holocaust fatigue. and this risk of public discourse of having something which becomes superficial is something that we also should keep in mind. And global points of reference is the other thing that I would like to point out. There are many similarities. Again, it's not about comparing, it's not about equating, it's neither about competing, it's about listening to each other, and the Holocaust can be a point of reference in order to discuss what it feels to be part of a minority, feeling of being discriminated, of being a victim of a persecution, coping strategies of survival, also experiencing solidarity and rescue. And like as in the constructivist theory suggests that we can only learn what pre-exists already in our minds, we can only connect to what we already know, this can be a quite of a good point of departure. Listen and connect, find open ways to connect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for not having much more time for questions, because I think, we could continue, and I hope it will be continued because you can approach our panelists later during the lunch break that is going to start in a moment. I cannot but resist the urge to express the wish that I hope we soon find ourselves in post-war society, really, or maybe hopefully no-war society, where we can really implement what we are talking about.
Hopefully.
Exactly, no more wars. Thank you very much.